Hi everyone, we are going to start chapter 6, which discusses language. And here are the concepts that we're going to cover. The nature of language, the impact of language, the language of responsibility, and then gender in language. Here are the learning objectives. We're going to explain the symbolic, rule-based, subjective, culture-bound nature of language, recognize the impact, both positive and negative, of language in interpersonal relationships, use language that reflects responsibility for thoughts and actions, describe the influence gender has on language used in interpersonal relationships. The nature of language. Language is symbolic. Words are arbitrary and symbols, and they have no inherent meanings. So for example, the word 5 is a kind of code that represents the number of fingers on your hand only because we agree that it does. There is nothing particularly 5-like in the number 5. Even in sign language as spoken by most deaf people, it is symbolic in nature because this form of communication is symbolic and not literal. There are hundreds of different sign languages used around the world that have evolved independently. So whenever significant numbers of deaf people have come in contact, there are distinct languages included in American Sign Language, Mexican Sign Language, British Sign Language, French Sign Language, and so on and so forth. So they're going to all communicate differently, just as we would have, different types of people as they come together with different types of languages or accents and so on. So language is rule governed. You have phonological rules, which are going to govern how sounds are combined to form words. For instance, the word champagne, double, and occasion have the same meanings in French as in English, but their pronunciations differ across the two languages because of different phonological rules. Whereas phonological rules determine how spoken languages sounds, syntax rules govern the way symbols can be arranged. So notice the following statements contain the same words, but a shift in syntax creates different meanings. Whiskey makes you sick when you're well. And then here's a difference. Whiskey, comma, when you're sick, comma, makes you well. So this just shows a difference in how the syntax in these two statements will make a difference. Then we have semantic rules, which governs the meaning of language as opposed to its structure. And these make it possible for us to agree that bikes are for riding and books are for reading. Without semantic rules, communication would be impossible. Each of us would use symbols in unique ways and it would be unintelligible to others. Semantic rules help us understand the meaning of individual words, but they often don't explain how language operates in everyday life. Let's consider the statement, let's get together tomorrow. The semantic meaning of the word in this sentence is clear enough, yet the statement could be taken in several different ways. It could be a straightforward invitation, I hope we can get together tomorrow, a polite command, I want to see you, or an empty cliche, I don't really want to see you. We learn to distinguish the accurate meanings of these different speech acts through pragmatic rules, which tells us what uses and interpretations of a message are appropriate in a given context. And as usual, I'll skip the discussions and we can go through these further in our live meetings. Language is subjective and is going to vary among how it's interpreted among people, not just in the words themselves. If the rules of language were more precise and if everyone followed them, we would suffer from fewer misunderstandings. You have an hour-long argument about feminism, only to discover that you were using the term in different ways and that you really were in a basic agreement. You teased a friend in what you meant to be a playful manner, but he takes you seriously and is offended. These problems occur because people attach different meanings to the same message. Language and worldview can be understood by the theory of linguistic relativism, which states that a culture is both shaped and reflected by the language its members speak. The best known expression of linguistic relativism is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which holds that linguistic terms actively shape the thinking and actions of people. So, what is the impact of language in naming and identity? Names shape the ways that other people think about us, the way we view ourselves, and the way that we act. Some studies have shown that people with non normative names can even suffer psychological and emotional disturbance, and such names are sometimes even seen negatively, which can make a impact over time if people make fun of somebody because they have a name that people dislike or if they see as different. I'm not sure if you can think about an instance in school where somebody had an unusual name and the person was made fun of and the type of impact that that had on them. I know in my instance, my name is Hope. Let's think about that. I have not met that many people with my name. It is a little bit, I guess, considered unique. In this instance, I like my name. My name is generally associated with positive things. It's happy, I guess, hope and faith and love and all that stuff. So generally, there's a positive connotation to it. So it is viewed in a positive light. But maybe if it wasn't, then it could have a negative circumstance. But it says for more than a century, researchers have studied the impact of rare and unusual names and the people who bear them. Early studies claim that people with non normative names suffered everything from psychological and emotional disturbance to even failure in college. Later studies showed that people often have negative appraisals, not only of unusual names, but also if they have unusual name spellings. In one study, for example, people with unusual names were judged least likely to be hired. Of course, what makes a name and its spelling unusual is going to change with time. In 1900, the 20 most popular names for baby girls in the United States included Bertha, Mildred, and Ethel. By 2015, the top 20 names included Madison, Maya, and Sophia, names that would have been highly unusual a century earlier. Some people regard unique names as a distinction. You can probably think of 4 or 5 unique names of celebrities, sports stars, or even personal friends that make the person easily recognizable and memorable. In one study, a poem signed with an unusual name was assessed as more creative than when signed by a person who had a more common name. Sometimes the choice of unique names is connected with a cultural identity. For example, in some parts of the United States, nearly a third of African American girls born in the 1990s were given distinctively Black names that belonged to no one else in the state. Researchers suggest that distinctive names like these are symbolic of the solidarity with the African American community. So again, this just kind of further justifies some of the specific studies that they've done related to names and identity and the type of consequences that it maybe can have. I've seen other studies related to hiring and taking identical resumes and putting different names on them to see if it influences biases or discrimination related to that. So it's just interesting, I think, to think about naming and biases, internal biases that people have related to that. Next, we look at affiliation. Convergence is the process of adapting one's speech style to match that of others with whom the communicator wants to identify. Divergence is speaking in a way that emphasizes differences. And so I'm going to give you some different examples related to this too. So an impressive body of research shows how language can build and demonstrate solidarity with others. Communicators adapt their speech in a variety of ways to indicate affiliation, accommodation, including through their choice of vocabulary, rate of talking, number and placement of pauses, and their level of politeness. In one study, the likelihood of mutual romantic interest increased when conversation partners' use of pronouns, articles, conjunctions, prepositions, and negations matched. The same study revealed that when couples use similar language styles while messaging online, the chances of their relationship continuing increased by almost 50%. So essentially, what they're saying is when people were talking and they matched the style of how the other person was communicating through text messaging or on social media, they were more likely to have the relationship continue. So if they were matching the pattern of speech, if they were matching the type of vocabulary that the person was using, then the person liked them better because they thought that they were like them. We've already talked about in other chapters, we like people that are like us. We like people that we think are similar to us. We like people that we think like similar hobbies to us. So why would we not like people that we think talk like us or communicate similar to us or have the same language that we do? It's the same exact thing that we've kind of discussed. And I feel like we often adapt our language without even realizing it. Think about if you go to work, you adapt probably a different tone at work that's probably more polite and more formal or respectful without even realizing it. And then think about when you go out with your friends, you probably talk very different. Maybe you use slang words, or maybe you have inside jokes or a different type of style of talking that only you and your friends use or that you only communicate among with them. So that's just one example. Divergence is, again, when you emphasize the differences. So again, I'll give you some examples of that. So communicators who want to set themselves apart from others adopt the opposite. For example, members of an ethnic group might want to use their own dialect as a way of showing solidarity with one another. So this can also happen across age lines, such as teens who want to emphasize slang of a subculture. So they will use that to emphasize that they're young or that they don't want to seem like they're older. So think about in high school. Do you remember making up slang words in high school because you just wanted to, even though it made no sense? And I hear slang words now that I have no idea what they mean, and it makes you feel old. And so that's one example of divergence. Next, we're going to move on to power and politeness. So, powerless speech is tentative, indirect, hedges, hesitations, disclaimers. Powerful language is direct, forceful declarations, assertions. Politeness saves face for both the sender and the receiver, and it often includes evasion. So I will include some examples. Let's notice a difference between these two statements from an employee to a manager. Excuse me, sir, I hate to say this, but I guess I won't be able to finish the project on time. I have a personal emergency and, well, it's just impossible to finish it by today. I'll have it to you by the first thing on Monday, okay? That's the first example. Now I'm going to give you the second example. I won't be able to finish the project on time. I have a personal emergency and it was impossible to finish it by today. I will have it to you first thing on Monday. So again, those were two different examples trying to show. The first statement is an example of what has been called powerless language, where it's the tentative, indirect word choices with the hedges and hesitations, where you use excuse me, sir, I guess, okay, where you're asking a question. The second is labeled powerful language, where it's more direct, forceful word choices with the declarations and assertions, I won't, I will. Studies have shown that speakers who use powerful speech are rated as more competent, dynamic, and attractive than speakers who use powerless language. In addition, when it comes to employment interview outcomes, a powerful speech style results in more positive attributions of competence and employability than a powerless one. I'm sure you guys can all think of examples or reasons why this may be. When you sound more confident about what you're saying, people believe you. They believe what you're saying and feel, confident in who you are and how you're speaking. People can tell when you are feeling unsure, if you're feeling nervous, and that's going to translate into how you're speaking. If you're constantly saying, ooh, I don't know, and using those hedges and indirect statements, people recognize that. And politeness, I'm sure you guys can all think of multiple examples. Some scholars question the label powerless because tentative and indirect speech styles can sometimes achieve goals better than assertive approaches. And an example is a less assertive approach can be attempts at politeness, and that's when you are communicating in ways that save face for both the sender and the receiver. Politeness is valued in some cultures more than others. For example, in Japan, saving face for others is an important goal, so communicators there tend to speak in more ambiguous terms and they use hedge words and qualifiers. In most Japanese sentences, the verbs come at the end of a sentence, so the action part of the statement can be postponed. Traditional Mexican culture, with its strong emphasis on cooperation, also uses hedging to smooth over interpersonal relationships. By not taking a firm stand with their speech and mannerisms, Mexicans believe they will not make others feel ill, and they're trying to make people feel at ease when they speak with them. So politeness is, especially in other cultures, is considered a good thing. I think in the US, we are obviously all about more powerful and direct language. And we are generally a lot more assertive about how we address things. Next topics that you have probably seen discussed a lot can be sexism and racism. Sexist language includes words, phrases, and expressions that unnecessarily differentiate between females and males or exclude or diminish either sex. This type of speech can affect the self-concepts of women and men, which is why the author argues that this is a form of hate speech. And sexist language can also cause stereotyping. And then racist language reflects a worldview that classifies members of one racial group as superior and the others as inferior. A first step in avoiding unintentionally racist language is eliminating potentially offensive labels. And here are some other examples related to this. So beyond just stereotyping, sexist language can stigmatize women. For example, the term unmarried mother is common, but we don't often talk about unmarried fathers because for many people, there's no stigma attached to this status for men. Whereas there are over 200 English words for promiscuous women, there are only 20 for men. Perhaps that's why attitudes towards women is a significant predictor of attitudes regarding non-sexist language. Education and perspective taking are also positively related to mindsets about inclusive language. There are at least two ways to eliminate sexist language. The first includes by eliminating sex-specific terms or just using neutral terms. For example, you can just say they, and you can say like mankind, humanity, human beings, human race, people. Or when it comes to like professions, you can just say, let's see, it's talking about specific professions. Say labor workers, workforce, instead of saying like firemen or stewardess or what, or a lot of, I feel like professions are very specific to gender, and so that's where it gets dicey. We don't have to specify if it's one gender or another. I don't think we even realize that. I think that they're getting better at eliminating that, but there still are a lot of professions where it specifies towards one gender or another. Oops, let me see. Okay, go back. Let me go down, sorry. And then precision and vagueness. Most people assume that the goal of language is to make our ideas clear to one another. When clarity is the goal, we need language skills to make our ideas understandable to others. Sometimes, however, we want to be less than perfectly clear. And here are some examples when that might be needed. Ambiguous language consists of words and phrases that have more than one commonly accepted definition. Some ambiguous language is amusing, as the following newspaper headline illustrate. Police begin campaign to run down jaywalkers. Teacher strikes idle kids. 20-year friendship ends at the altar. So many misunderstandings that arise from ambiguity, if I can say it, ambiguous situations essentially are trivial. And this happens in text messages a lot too. So ambiguous language is, essentially consists of words and phrases that have more than one meaning or more than one commonly accepted definitions. So you can recall eating dinner at a Mexican restaurant and ordering a tostada with beans instead of being served a beef tostada with beans on the side. We were surprised to see the waiter bring us a plate containing a tostada filled with beans. Other misunderstandings involving ambiguous messages can be more serious. A nurse gave one of her patients a scare when she told him that he wouldn't be needing his robe, books, and shaving materials anymore. The patient became quiet and moody. When the nurse inquired about the odd behavior, she discovered that the poor man had interpreted her statement to mean he was going to die. In fact, the nurse meant he was going to be going home. So it's difficult to, interpret each of these situations. So abstractions are convenient ways of generalizing about similarities between several objects, people, ideas, or events. And then there's an abstraction ladder. There's a diagram that demonstrates this. It shows how we can use a range of specifics to abstract terms for describing an object, event, or situation. Euphemisms are terms substituted for blunt ones. They are typically used to soften the impact of information that might be unpleasant. Relative language gains meaning by comparison. Using terms without explaining them can lead to communication problems. Evaluative language seems to describe something, but in reality announces the speaker's attitude towards it. I'm going to show you the abstraction ladder right here and kind of explain it a little bit in more detail. So it's showing we use higher level abstractions all the time. For instance, rather than saying thanks for washing the dishes, vacuuming the rug, and making the bed, we might more abstractly say thanks for cleaning up. In such everyday situations, abstractions can be a useful kind of verbal shorthand. High level abstractions can help communicators find face saving ways to avoid confrontations and embarrassment. If a friend apologizes for arriving late for a date, you can choose to brush off the incident instead of making it an issue by saying, "Don't worry, it wasn't the end of the world." A true statement, but less specific than saying, "To tell you the truth, I was mad at the time, but I've cooled off now." If your boss asked your opinion of a new idea that you think is weaker than your own approach, but you don't want to disagree, you could respond with a higher level of abstraction by saying, "I never thought of it that way." Although vagueness does have its uses, highly abstract language can cause several types of problems. At the most basic level, the vagueness of some abstract language makes it hard to understand the meaning of the message. For example, if you told your hairstyle shorter, or "I like it more casual," without providing very specific instructions, maybe you're going to get an unpleasant haircut. Overly abstract language can also lead to stereotyping. For instance, someone who has had a bad experience can blame an entire group of people. Marriage counselors are worthless. All New Yorkers are so rude. All men are terrible. Overly abstract expressions such as these can cause people to think in problematic generalities and ignore specific uniqueness. So hopefully that explains that in more detail. I do want to go back to this a little bit and talk about like when you'll use euphemisms because a euphemism avoids a direct and literal reference to an event. or it can be substitute a term to describe its consequence or related events or a metaphor. And they're usually used to soften the impact of information if it's unpleasant. I think it's easy to imagine how it might be used in a situation. I'm not ready for a commitment. I want to date other people, or just other types of topics like that. Or relative language, maybe you want to use that in an example. For example, do you attend a large or small school? This depends on what you compare it to. Alongside a campus such as Ohio State's with more than 60,000 students, your school may look small, but compared with a college of 1,500 students, your school may seem quite large. Relative words such as fast and slow, near and far, and short and long are clearly defined only through comparison. And then evaluative language examples. If you approve, you say thrifty. If you disapprove, you say cheap. Or traditional versus old-fashioned, extrovert versus loudmouth, cautious versus coward, progressive versus radical, information versus propaganda. I don't know if it has a slide on it. I think it only has it for discussion, but I'll briefly discuss it. So the language of responsibility and accountable language. So its statements replaces the personal pronouns I and me with its, which avoids responsibility for ownership of a message. A but statement has the effect of canceling the thought that precedes it. I language is a way of accepting responsibility, while you language expresses judgment of another person. Assertiveness involves using an I message to clearly express thoughts, feelings, and wants, while we language implies joint concern and responsibility for both the speaker and the receiver. And then the language of choice. Words that follow pronouns are important ingredients in responsible communication. Right here. I'm going to talk to my neighbor about the barking dog instead of I have to talk to my neighbor about the barking dog. Or I will start being nicer to my roommate instead of I should be nicer to my roommate. So these are just some examples and how this varies when you use the language of choice. There is some good examples of this in some diagrams in the book too that I'm looking at of the I, you, and we. Too much of any pronoun can come across as inappropriate when you're using the I, you, we language. If your I language reflects your position without being overly self-absorbed, your you language should show concern for others without judging them, and your we language should include others without speaking for them. Next, we're going to look at gender and language. Some people believe that men and women communicate in significantly different ways, whereas often they find far more similarities than differences. In 1992, John Gray argued that men and women are so fundamentally different that they might as well have come from separate planets. In his best-selling book, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, he claimed in this following excerpt that I'll briefly read. Men and women differ in all areas of their lives. Not only do men and women communicate differently, but they think, feel, perceive, react, respond, love, need, and appreciate differently. They almost seem to be from different planets, speaking different languages and needing different nourishment. Gray's work is based largely on anecdotes and conjecture and lacks scholarly support. However, social scientists have acknowledged that there are some significant differences in the way that men and women behave socially. These findings have led some scholars to describe males and females as a member of distinct cultures, with their differences arising primarily from socialization rather than from biology. One of the best known advocates of this is a two-culture theory. They suggest that men and women grow up learning different rules about how to speak and act. So men and women are essentially learning different things and as they grow up. And within this, they report that men are more likely than women to speak in sentence fragments. Men are more likely to talk about themselves with I references. Like a men are more likely to say, I have a lot of meetings, and they will use more judgmental language. They find that female speech is more tentative, elaborate, and emotional. For instance, women's sentences are typically longer than men's. Women also make more references to feelings and intense adverbs. He's really interested. That paint a more complete verbal picture. In addition, female speech is often less assertive. It contains more statements of uncertainty. It seems to be we're kind of set in our ways, and they generally have tag questions. Do you think so? Some theorists have argued that such differences cause women's speech to come off as less powerful, but more inclusive than men's language. And then, despite these differences in the way that men and women speak, the link between the gender and language isn't as clear cut as it might seem. In one of the studies that had 3,000 participants, they found that women were only slightly more likely than men to use tentative speech. In other analysis, they looked for gender differences in adults' talkativeness, their affiliative speech, and assertive speech, and found that there was small differences for all of these language constructs. Basically, it showed that men and women's speech are very similar, more similar than different. They found that women use slightly more intense adverbs and personal pronouns than men did. And then it also said that it says that there's really, not huge differences, not as big of differences as they originally thought in how men and women communicate. And they're not as clear cut. And then non-gender influences on language use. We have conversation, setting, and power. So gender isn't the only factor that influences how women and men use language. These are the other factors that influence it. So occupation is one factor. An example, Male and female athletes communicate in very similar ways. Male daycare teachers, their speech to their students resembles the language of female teachers more closely than it resembles the language of fathers at home. Female farm operators working in male dominant worlds reproduce the masculinity that spells success for their male counterparts, um, because they talk similar and adapt to similar styles. Another factor that can trump gender is power. For instance, in gay and lesbian relationships, the conversational styles of partners are more strongly linked to power differences in the relationship. For example, it might be who's earning more money than to gender. There are also a few differences between the way that men and women use threatening speech when they have the same amount of bargaining strategy in negotiations. These findings suggest that characteristics related to feminine and masculine speech have less of a function than gender or sex than of social power. So obviously it's not just one thing that's influencing this. It can be conversation, it can be setting, it can be power, it can be all these other things that are making a difference on the situation. Whoops. Somehow I'm like way far in here. One thing I didn't have a slide on, but I wanted to mention that I thought was interesting. Oh, it's on here as kind of a discussion. It was kind of mentioned at the end of the book. It talks about that. It talks about online language and impression management, and then social media and language. So kind of this was talked about earlier on. So much of the online communication is impression management, and text message errors can make the sender look bad. So we're constantly trying to manage our impression management through our language. One way to do that is by managing how we communicate, the type of language that we're using. And dating websites are definitely all about impression management and the type of language that you're using on that online on that. It's interesting because it says that women are more likely than men to lie about, you know, some of their physical features on here. But it says men are often more likely to lie or misrepresent their professions and income, which that makes sense. I think that makes sense. And then let's recap. So we explained the symbolic, rule-based, subjective, culture-bound nature of language. We recognize the impact, both positive and negative, of language in interpersonal relationships. We used language that reflects responsibility for thoughts and actions. We described the influence gender has on language use in interpersonal relationships. And that is all for chapter 6.